So, welcome everybody to this AI ethics seminar with Beth Singler from the University of Cambridge. I've started recording, so everyone is aware of that. Beth will talk about the dreams our stuff is made of. Trust, agency, and super agency. And without further ado, or maybe let's just say first that the plan is to have a talk for around 45 minutes, something like that, and then we'll have some 15 minutes for Q&A towards the end. But feel free during the talk to post questions in the chat, and I'll distribute the word towards the end. Anyway, Beth Singler, happy to have you here. Please.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to come speak to you all today. I'm going to share my slides. Let's pray this works. It just did. So let's see if it will work again. Okay. Go on. There we go. Okay, good. Yes, so I am Dr. Beth Singler. I am a junior research fellow at Homerton College at the University of Cambridge. I'm primarily an anthropologist, although I engage with questions around the ethics of AI and how we can use AI ethically. But I'm just going to give you very briefly an introduction to how I do my research, what my research is about, where I look for details for my research. So as an anthropologist, I'm very much about being engaged with the lived experience that people have. So being in the places where, as much as possible, people engage with artificial intelligence and robots, and where they imagine those things as well. So a variety of locations here, from tech conferences to, you might recognize some museum exhibits, some memes. I'm a digital ethnographer, so I spend a lot of my time on social media. You may have found me on there once before, but this is a space in which I look at and observe the conversation around AI and robots and how people imagine them. So a few examples there. So the primary technique I would use is participant observation. So being in places, as I said, like a transhumanist conference or a tech marketing exhibition or a toy shop in Tokyo, as in this GIF, watching children interact with very limited small-scale robots. I pay attention to ethnographic moments, so online responses to AI breakthroughs when there's a particular development that people are talking about, also tension points when people are pushing back against particular developments. Internet research itself actually requires boundary making. Obviously, the internet is so immensely huge that we have to determine edges to our research field. So an ethnographic place that's formed by collections of things that become entwined, as Pink says, or looking at the internet event, a moment in time. So as I say, particular reactions to particular developments, how people cast their responses to that. The title for the talk today, some of you may have come across this before. If not, I am citing someone. It's not my amazingly good title, but The Dreams Our Stuff is Made Of by Dish, How Science Fiction Conquered the World, back from 1998. It's a fabulous text. It doesn't directly deal with AI because not so much of a concern in 1998, but one of the quotes that really sticks with me is this one from page 226. In dreams being, oh wow, I've done a typo already. In dreams, begin responsibilities, but it's no less true that in dreams begin irresponsibilities. The menu in terms of our possibilities in both those respects is well nigh infinite. I would take this broader to look not only at science fiction influences, but others, and I'm going to describe what those are and where they come from and how they interact with each other. So what seems primarily quite a simple question, but is increasingly difficult to answer, what is artificial intelligence? You may well list some of the applications as a way of describing what AI is. So natural language processing or facial recognition, the playing of particular games, automated decision-making algorithms, automation in robotic form, recommendation algorithms, and diagnostics in healthcare would be a short and not entirely comprehensive list, but one in which we might indicate towards both the field of artificial intelligence and where it's used and what kinds of results we get from it. I would argue, however, that around this kernel of what AI is are all the ways in which we perceive it and the influences that get in the way of seeing its actual direct applications and uses right now. So things like charismatic authorities and voices, who are we listening to in the conversation around AI, commercial hype, Even religious narratives. This is a particular interest of my work, but one that's sometimes surprising to people when we start talking about artificial intelligence. The combination of both utopianism and dystopianism playing against each other. And of course, those play out a lot in science fiction narratives. And we're going to talk about a few of those in my talk today. And again, another binary, robomorphism and anthropomorphism. So you may be more familiar with the latter, this idea that we increasingly see the non-human as human-like, but there's a counterpoint to that, the increasing vision of the human as robot-like, sort of these two polar opposites becoming closer and closer as we increasingly treat the human as robotic and the robotic as human, and the kind of ethical impulses that leads to. All these elements, I argue, lead to some people to the perception that we already have human-level intelligence, even superintelligence, this nebulous thing called consciousness, or even, as some people talk about, the technological singularity already now. We can summarize all of these different types as forms of AI with agency or superagency, and that's part of what I want to talk to you about today. But we're going to start with the first word in my list of subtopics, trust. I think there's an important approach here from an anthropological perspective on the nature of trust, and then I'll relate trust more to our conceptions of AI. So some people see trust as a cognitive category, all dependent on assessments of the trustworthiness of the potential trusted person. It's a decision that we make based on that person that we meet. But trust may also be encapsulated in reciprocal expectations. There is a two-way relational relationship that goes on between two beings. But as Alberto Constantin-Jimenez said in 2011, it's also distributed in a variety of human and non-human forms. And of course, the public discourse about tech and trust is very vibrant at the moment. So I want to push this forward and say that we intuit trust in relation to things as well as people, sometimes seeing both as beings with agency. And this is a key word for my talk today. In terms of trusting AI, we sometimes get particular perspectives fed to us at a very high level, going back to what I was saying about charismatic authorities. So Boris Johnson, whatever you may think about him, is still a charismatic authority. Here he is speaking at the UN General Assembly in September 2019, where he talks about whether algorithms can be trusted with our lives and hopes, should the machines and only the machines decide whether or not we are eligible for a mortgage or insurance. Or what about surgeries or medicines we should receive? Are we doomed to a cold and heartless future in which computer says no, or yes, or computer says no, with the grim finality of an emperor in the arena? Obviously, there's a few pop culture references he's drawing on there, but this sort of top-level narrative has an impact on how AI is received. Furthermore, he pushed it into a more dystopic, apocalyptic direction in the same talk. AI, what will it mean? Helpful robots washing and caring for an aging population, or pink-eyed Terminators sent back for the future to control the human race? I take objection to him calling them pink-eyed, but maybe he's got a colorblind issue, but they are generally considered red-eyed. As I said, he's a charismatic authority in this space, repeating certain lines and narratives that he's been fed by people who are interested in this direction. It's again a very strongly utopian versus dystopian narrative that he's presenting. It's a strong binary. The Y's dropped off the edge there. The truth is much more complicated than that, of course, and the lack of transparency about the abilities of AI, but also where the human is still very much involved in the decision-making process, makes it harder to debate AI ethics. We see this more broadly, not just from this top-down perspective, but in the popular discourse in the press about artificial intelligence. I have some samples here of my collection of Terminator imagery in the press. There's a few of my favorites there. The announcement about the Cambridge Terminator Center. This is a few years back, which, if you're aware, is the Center for Studies in Existential Risk, which, while they do discuss the Terminator in terms of imagery, they are not offering Terminator studies as a course, although critical Terminator studies would be very interesting. One of my particular favorites there from the Daily Star, which has the standard nuclear explosion, but also they created their own Terminator female there that doesn't relate to any of the images from the actual films, but it being the Daily Star, it had to be very feminized. So there's a variety of responses and attitudes there, the summation of what AI is up to with the shorthand of the dystopian. And even when we don't rely on science fiction imagery, some of our ways of personifying AI can get in the way of the common discussion that we need to have about AI ethics. So for instance, Sophia the Hanson robot fed this line through the data set that she has and producing the words, okay, I will destroy humans, which of course is repeated and reported on multiple locations. But this again presents a particular view of the standard of AI that we've reached and where we're going. Some of my work is around specifically people's anxieties when it comes to AI, presenting a sort of anthropology of AI anxiety. Some instances here from social media, people saying that they're super afraid of artificial intelligence and robots, people using the hashtag Robopocalypse, people using memes and imagery. I'm not scared of a computer passing the Turing test. I'm terrified of one that intentionally fails it. And people talking about the specific words of artificial general intelligence and the singularity. So people are picking up these concepts and demonstrating their anxieties around them. I want to give you a couple of specific examples of AI apocalypticism and anxiety that I think are particularly useful to think with. So the case of AlphaStar and the 29 scientist conspiracy theory. If you're familiar with AlphaStar, this might be a bit repetitive for you, but it was a development in the AI games playing scenario that over the decades, we've attempted various different forms of games using AI as a player. And the potential space for each of these games has increased so that it was speculated on that StarCraft 2, a military strategy computer game with alien races, might be beyond the capabilities because of its large potential space versus something like Tic-Tac-Toe, which only has a set board size. Obviously, if you're familiar with this is an out-of-date chart that actually in 2019, AlphaStar did particularly well against human players playing StarCraft 2. I was actually at the time at a transhumanist conference when the news came through that AlphaStar had defeated human players at StarCraft 2. And it was a sort of almost a World Cup feeling of people cheering and being very excited that something they thought wouldn't come along actually for decades, a few people had bet on when it would happen, had actually now happened in 2019. This chart here gives you a demonstration of the capabilities of AlphaStar that supervised learning AI agents, sort of muddled around that sort of mid area of MMR as a sort of rating system for how good something is at playing StarCraft 2. And then AlphaStar, over only a few training days there, successfully surpassed humans, TLO, who plays the race Protoss, and Mana as another human playing, so successfully going beyond the grandmaster status there. And this happened very quickly, so the exponential growth of this very narrow form of intelligence inspired people to think along these lines, the exponential growth of intelligence as in Moore's law, and the speculation that this would proceed somewhat towards the singularity at some point. I enjoy using this chart because if you look very closely, I hope it's clear, it's actually hugely out of date. So it suggests that we will at some point surpass the brain power of a mouse. They predicted 2015 and the brain power of a human in 2023. Well, we haven't succeeded in those, but the overall trajectory, the telos that's being imagined here, indicates towards a particular view of progress and the direction of the future that something like this chart and the development of AlphaStar seems to coincide with. But then that draws in some of those singularity fears that people have. So we have also in social media some online responses to this moment with AlphaStar, people saying things like, "We are doomed, part 2,300,000 or so forth. Hashtag humanity is doomed, all hail the hashtag AI. People saying, I fear for the future of the human race. Someone being relieved that there was actually a win by a human. This is when they actually changed the way in which the AI could see the map at a particular point in the competition. So there was finally, someone says, a win by a biological organism. Humanity can breathe a sigh of relief. And bottom right there, drawing again on popular tropes and popular culture, I'm hoping hashtag Skynet won't see me as a threat. So the different distance between a moment in time with an AI development and the jump instantly into apocalypticism can be quite short there. Now, the 29 scientist conspiracy theory is a relatively small, unappreciated conspiracy theory. It's not really up there with the likes of things like QAnon, but it was a particular moment, as I say, an ethnographic internet moment that I noticed happening at a particular point. I was at a conference at the time when I saw people starting to talk about this. And it's about the claims of what happens when AI comes alive. It's very much drawing on those same sorts of Skynet tropes. I have the video here. The original video, unfortunately, is no longer available, but I have a video debunking the original video. So let's see if that will work. I'm just checking the sound's working. Yep, okay. Carry on.
At a top robotics company in Japan this week, 4 robots being developed for military applications killed 29 humans in the lab. The scariest part is that lab workers deactivated 2 of the robots, took apart the 3rd, but the 4th robot began restoring itself and somehow connected to an orbiting satellite to download information about how to rebuild itself even more strongly than before.
Okay, let's pause that. How do I go back to if I escape? There we go. So looking at the time that this story was present and shared on social media, primarily on Twitter, the responses, this is a Twitter affect measurement, the responses really peaked around that 19th of December 2018 date, but we can also see this distinction between positive responses and negative responses. And looking at samples of those, it was very much around fear, anxiety, concern that this was actually something that had specifically happened. The debunking is very simple. There's no evidence. There's actually inconsistencies in the story. Sometimes it was reported as being in Korea, sometimes it was in Japan. There's definitely distinct elements of sort of a techno-Orientalism in the story, and it was very easily pushed to one side. But even on the debunking video I've just shown, the comments in response to that still assert that this might be true. So things like, ever see those movies where they make the truth tellers seem crazy? Well, this is it. This did happen. Don't let other media and government try to hide it. Do you want to know how someone's telling the truth? Is that they get called a conspiracy theorist. So awareness of a sort of othering that they propose is happening. If robots can parkour, they can definitely kill. If this didn't happen, it very well could happen. So referencing the Boston Dynamics robots in their videos, it's like an AI robot made this PSA to make us ignore their uprising, my particular favorite, the idea that the robots are actually in some way behind this debunking of the conspiracy theory. Now, you don't have to get too far into conspiracy theories to actually see negative and anxious responses to AI. So going back to Boris Johnson and his involvement with the representation of algorithms, we've had a situation in the UK last summer where the government under the headship of Boris Johnson was involved in making predictions using a grading algorithm because of the lack of the ability to have A-level exams during COVID. This algorithm limited the numbers of how many students could receive certain grades. It was historically predicated on the success or failure of particular schools rather than the individual's abilities to succeed against those odds, and actually ended up downgrading around 40% of the students from their predicted grades. Obviously, there was pushback against this. The illustration here of it being a particular protest where people are looking at the algorithm in particular. There's some imagery there of Boris Johnson, but the language around fuck the algorithm, the sense of, excuse my language, this sense of indicating towards the technology rather than the individuals. And this was enhanced by Boris himself, Boris Johnson, saying that he blamed the mutant algorithm for the exam fiasco, as though this was a naturally evolving thing that hadn't been set up with certain values and weights and measures that indicated a preference from the human creators of the algorithm. The two-handed approach here would be to recognize that both trust and distrust exist around AI. We've been talking primarily with the apocalyptic about distrust, but the counter to that is over-trusting. So AI being seen as a being and better at making decisions than humans. So a counterpoint to the A-level algorithm, which is now hugely distrusted. So, for instance, here, people saying that they would trust AI more than the government because in some ways they believe it to be more rational. People saying, I trust AI more than I trust people. I'm honestly not afraid at all. I honestly believe I don't have a shred of fear for AI or what the future will bring. I trust AI more than humans because AI learns, and apparently humans don't learn. Specifically, political tweet, I trust AI more than I trust Republicans. You might also find the one that says that about Democrats. And people tweeting to Elon Musk, asking him to start the Skynet project, again, that popular culture reference, saying that he trusts, or they trust, I trust AI more than our current leadership. Again, science fiction in some ways gets there beforehand, as Dish was arguing. But actually, we have stories about AI and robotic politicians that feed into this idea of rationality for AI that could be more successful than human politicians. So, The Evitable Conflict by Isaac Asimov, himself very famous for his laws of robotics. In this story, Dr. Susan Calvin, the robo-psychologist, encounters examples of where humans are being harmed through the world AI's choices. And this would seem to be against the laws of robotics, the first law being that a robot cannot harm a human or through an action allow a human to come to harm. But what has happened is the zeroth law has evolved out of interactions between AI and society, that the AI has deduced that actually, in a utilitarian sense, the greater good is better, and that actually the harm of a few individual humans for that greater good could be for all the good overall. It's interesting that by the end of the story, Dr. Susan Calvin sort of shrugs and says, well, this is perhaps the better system, and leaves it be rather than reacting to this development of a new law. This is a science fiction tale, obviously, but again, it feeds into those ideas about the greater rationality of AI. More recent examples would include Westworld. I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, but in the third season, which has been out for a while now, Rehoboam is a world AI, much like the one in The Evitable Conflict from Asimov, that also makes decisions about humans and their destiny, partially based on the data that it receives about their potential. So much like the A-level algorithm in some ways, but that science fiction step further of creating a super agency. So a quote here from the actual storyline. My dad, that's the creator of Rehoboam, thought the biggest problem in the world was unrealized potential. Liam, the son of the creator, tells Dolores, who is herself an AI. He thought that if you could chart a course for every single person, that you could make the world a better place. A path for everyone, Dolores replies, and Liam nods. This sense of destiny created through the AI, feeding from our science fiction into popular discourse. I want to just say briefly that I've chosen these two images after consultation with some colleagues through social media in the last day or so, that I wanted a bad image of an AI making a decision, something that personifies it in particular ways. So we've got a combination there. I couldn't actually choose between them because I thought they were both so good. But both cases, the sort of musing of an anthropomorphized AI robot looking at options, making a decision, umming and ahhing. Someone did also point out there's no reason for a robot to have a visor, but that's a sort of sub-point. But I want to use these as an illustration into the idea of agency and even super agency for AI with two particular case studies. The AI creation meme, which suggests agency through AI being created, and blessed by the algorithm, which is a phrase that in some particular cases suggests super agency in AI. And these are both examples from public discourse. So what is the AI creation meme? Well, very simply, it's a remix of the creation of Adam by Michelangelo. You may be familiar with the original. Here's an example from 2018, the European Commission document on developing an AI task force, a very overtly secular space in a way, but using this imagery that draws very strongly on a theistic interpretation of a relationship between God and human, remixed here into human and AI. Now, looking at the AI creation meme, I drew out 79 examples from the internet. Some were repetitive. There were variations in different aspects to them. The key attributes that I looked at, their sidedness, who was in the position of the deity and who was in the position of the created. And this did flip in certain circumstances, which may be more about aesthetics for the particular content and the space in which it was being employed. But also, if you think into terms of more theistic interpretations of AI, that might have something to say about our relationship with a more super agent super agential artificial intelligence that's taking the God position. The color palette was very interesting. Often blues predominated. So I looked at Alexandra Grease's work on blue brains in representations of neuroscience, where she applies an aesthetics of religion to say that blue itself is a color associated with rationality, the heavenly realm, and other aspects. I looked at the gender and race of the human hand, quite commonly male and white. There was very few examples of female, and I did not find a single example of a minority illustrating. The background imagery, sometimes there were things specific to the context that it was being used in. So if it was business, sort of skyscrapers or figures, sometimes there was this spark of life in the 3 examples there, not the 4th one. You see this spark in between the fingertips that's not in the original creation of Adam by Michelangelo. And the representations of data as an aesthetic thing as well in some examples. And also I looked at where the image was being used. And as I say, predominantly in spaces that you wouldn't necessarily describe as having religious links. So sort of business, finance, fintech, edtech, various different spaces. And there were specific themes and questions I felt evoked by the AI creation meme. So the continuity of theistic narratives and tropes in discourse, that, as I say, this distinction we tend to make between religious and secular, and what is going on politically and ideologically with that distinction, that actually these transitions of ideas and narratives between those 2 spheres is actually very interesting. That it was evoking the creation of AI as a profound moment, equivalent in our cultural memory to something like the creation of mankind. Our role in that act of creation, if we're positing that the human hand is indeed a human, then we are creating in this imagery AI in parallel to how some faiths believe God created mankind. What kind of relationship that implies and our responsibilities to our creation. What is the message that's being shared with this imagery about what we need to do for AI that is being developed? Also, there's the sense that some examples were parodying religion by remixing and memeing significant imagery. It's not unusual to see remixes of the creation of Adam. Some of my recent favorites I've come across have been Simpsons versions, Darth Vader and George Lucas. I even saw one created out of Satsuma pieces. So this is something we do quite frequently for humor. So is this in some ways an example of humor as well? And primarily, I want to focus here on the sense that this is presenting AI as a being with agency, much as we consider humans to have agency. So on that subject, and moving on to concepts of super agency, my second case study is the blessed by the algorithm tweets that I've written about before as well. Here, these are expressions primarily that I looked at on social media, on Twitter, of people feeling that because of a decision, an agential decision by the algorithm, that their day or something good has happened to them. So the primary example, the most retweeted example, was the Lyft Coleman tweet. So Keith Coleman here, who was a VP at Twitter, saying that he overheard, OH, from an awesome Lyft driver, so someone working in the gig economy as a driver, "Today has been great. I've been blessed by the algorithm." And he says immediately had an eerie feeling that this could become an increasingly common way to describe the day. So this sense that people are uplifting the decisions that are being made by very simplistic algorithmic systems and seeing them as in some way super agential, that there is something watching over them that has some of the characteristics of a deity. Now, I looked at 181 distinct tweets in a specific period. There have been more since, and I recognize as an anthropologist reflexively that by writing this paper and by talking about it, I've increased the number of tweets about it. But my initial research identified this period of time where from the first tweet back in 2014 to the end of my research on this particular topic in 2019, there were 181 distinctive tweets with a certain number of retweets, with the Lyft Coleman tweet in particular being very popular for retweeting. I made a typology of the types of tweets. So we already saw number 3, feeling blessed when working in a gig economy role. There's also success or failure of your own content on platforms like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. In what is being recommended to you on Spotify or YouTube if a particularly good song comes up on shuffle or the equivalent. The 4th, general or abstract. So someone just saying, "Today I've been blessed by the algorithm," with no particular reason provided. There's number 5, those that then carry on with the specifically religious content or pseudo-religious parody with religious emojis, other hashtags, perhaps writing a prayer to the algorithm, similar sorts of material. Negative tweets, people who felt that they were not blessed or they were nostalgic for a time before the algorithm controlled or blessed their content, and tweets containing science fiction references as well. I also looked at conceptions of why some people thought that they were blessed by their algorithm. So it could be luck. Some lucky souls are blessed by the algorithm and get noticed. Most are left to rot. The sense of being chosen, and that's specific to what I'm talking about with agency or super agency. You have been blessed by the algorithm, the chosen one. There is some sense of being specifically picked out. But they might have been virtuous in some way, which relates more to a kind of more general vision of what you need to do in a religious setting to be picked out by a deity. So clearly, you've been spending too much time browsing shitty content. Again, apologies for language. Only the most virtuous media consumers will be blessed by the algorithms, the sense there's some sort of behavior you can do to attract the attention of the algorithm and get its blessing. Why is this concept, blessed by the algorithm, so interesting? Isn't it just parody? Often a response I've come across, but I'm very interested in the relationship between parody and legitimation. Some of my previous work was looking more specifically at bounded new religious movements, so groups such as the Jedi who make a stance for being a specific religious group, even though they are very conscious of the fictional origins that inspire them. So in my 2014 paper, I looked specifically at concepts of how new religious movements acquire legitimation. Weber, a famous sociologist of religion, came up with 3 broad approaches. So from tradition, you can cite the history of a particular idea, from the internal rationality of an idea, and from charisma in specific cases with charismatic authorities and leadership. Now, when people study invented religions with a fictional origin that they're aware of, such as work done by Possamai and Cusack, there's often an attention drawn to the lack of tradition, that they are open about their createdness, so authority can't necessarily come through tradition. What I argued in 2014 is that conversations online can form a new tradition that can be indicated towards by users. And this can include parodies, which in the case of Jediism was some of the inspiration behind the surge in people claiming Jediism as their religion during the 2001 and 2011 UK censuses. So you get, in a sense, this snowballing of legitimacy in spaces, including social media, but also traditional media and the press, where something becomes an object that can be indicated towards, even when people are joking about it. So apologies if anyone here is aware of who this gentleman is. He's not one of my favorites, but he is someone who has publicly on one of our morning breakfast shows poked fun a little bit at Jediism, but had someone on that panel from one of the churches of Jediism, and therefore gave something that people could indicate towards and said that this is something that's being discussed. There might be something behind this. Just to summarize everything, I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I want to leave time for questions. I've looked at the nature of AI, how not only what it is as an application and a technology, but how it is also co-created with our perceptions of it, how we have that sort of onion of the kernel of what AI is, and then all those things around it, like charismatic authorities and hype and religious narratives, utopianism, dystopianism, anthropomorphism, robomorphism, all these things as a kind of outer shell around AI. I talked a bit about the nature of trust from an anthropological perspective, and how trust and distrust are both linked to representations of AI, that we have examples both of the fear and apocalypticism that result from people distrusting AI and where we're going with it, and also the overtrust, where examples where people see everyday algorithms as being more powerful and more able to create change in their lives than they are. That trust actually denudes the content of the role of humans within that. So assumptions about agency and super agency, with my examples of the blessed by the algorithm tweets and the AI creation meme. And overall, I want to highlight the danger of not recognizing the dreams our stuff is made of, to return to the title, and how this should be a topic for AI ethics. I think there's some really great work being done on images at the moment, images of AI by initiatives such as AI Myths, Better Images of AI and Not My Robot. And this is an ongoing conversation about how we can develop realistic images that are evocative and get people involved in the conversation, but that don't instill ideas of AI being more advanced than it currently is, and don't get in the way of recognizing where the human element is as well. So there are my contact details if you want to perhaps not ask questions now, but get in touch later. My website, which contains a lot of links to my research, as well as some blog posts you might find interesting. And I hope my talk has been interesting for you today as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth. So the floor is open to questions or comments.
Stunned silence.
I have a few questions myself.
Okay.
I can ask.
Not stunned.
Oh, who was that? Andrew?
I said not stunned silence, but I wanted somebody else to be first.
Politeness then.
Let me go first, Andrew, and then you can go. So I just a quick question on the Boris Johnson quotes.
Yeah.
Is it the case that, I mean, I think it's remarkable that he talks in these terms. Now, I happen to know that his former chief of staff, Dominic Cummings, has been close to the rationalist and transhumanist community. Do you think that this stuff comes through Cummings?
It's an interesting political situation with Dominic Cummings, because I'm sure you're aware he's sort of fallen out of favor, but there's still, I suppose, a certain element of his thinking and his work in the DNA of that conversation. Of that speech, that I'm pretty sure at some point there's been some sort of input along those lines. But I'm also very surprised that the strong binary, because some of the rationalist groups that I look at and the transhumanist groups are more cautious about those strong binaries, are much more utopian rather than, you know, strongly one or the other. But his speech, that second part that I put up, has the very strong, it's either going to be caring robots or it's going to be Terminators. And I think that, I mean, that plays more into, I suppose, his form of rhetoric. I mean, there's mentions of, you know, the emperor figure, Roman emperor. It's very much his sort of classical, his reference to classics, and having worked with him a long time ago in a very small capacity, I see that thread of rhetoric being completely a platform for this like strong binary that he's proposing there. I think that's something that's very common in his approach to speeches and in his writing more generally. So yeah, I think it's true that Dominic Cummings has had a huge role to play, certainly in UK plans for ARIA, the large sort of DARPA equivalent that they're planning here in the UK for tech development. But also he's at this moment kind of out of favor. Whether he comes back round and circles back round into favor at some point, we'll see.
Perhaps he has burned his bridges by now.
We'll just see.
Andrew?
Yeah, could you talk a little more about human agency in all this? Because the thing I feel very strongly is that any existing AI systems are actually hybrids or chimeras between humans and the system. I sometimes imagine the term merely a sort of piece of sensory apparatus for Google, you know, going around collecting things. And agency, therefore, is distributed very, very clearly between the machines and the networks and the humans. And to what extent is talking about AI removing agency from the humans and removing responsibility from the humans who make those choices?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the examples that we could draw on, particularly in surveillance culture, that take out the representation of the role of the human in deciding to not only implement the surveillance technology, but to acquiesce to it. So I would class things like Facebook within surveillance culture as well. And as you mentioned, Google with humans perhaps as the sensory apparatus for something that's data collecting. No, that's absolutely fair. And I think that's another part of the conversation. I think it's also in there to a certain extent around the suggestion of robomorphization, the increasing treating of the human as a machine, that then you get that connection between the literal machines and the human machines being much more easy to make. We see this in sort of Amazon factories where when there has been agency reinstored through protests, it's been around a discourse of I am not a robot, and the steps towards full automation require us to increasingly treat humans within those situations as robotic in some way, so they take away agency. I think that's an important addition to this as well. Okay, I can see a question coming in, but I'm not sure.
Yes, from Alexa Steinbrook. Can you read it? I'm not sure I understand it.
How would you define agency in Germany? There's no real equivalent. How does agency relate to consciousness? So having the capacity to make decisions, I suppose it gets into all the messiness of things like free will, but also the perception of agency. Consciousness is such a difficult one to bring into this conversation. I ended up making one of my short films on consciousness just because I was struggling to tackle with how it's used in such a multivocal way. So for some people, it's equivalent instantly to things like spirit and soul and agency and mind, and there's very little distinction made in some cases. But I think would the perception of an entity being able to decide things freely without being informed what to do, and there's that step change that's happening with AI, that we have a very clear view of it as being under control, and narratives around things like deep learning have encouraged this view of, because of the non-transparency of deep learning, have encouraged this view that AI is freely making choices that don't come from within those data sets. So one example, when AlphaGo played Lisa Dole, and I was saying this, this is a huge moment. Some people's responses to the specific moves were that the AI was doing something that was out of the bounds of the game, in a sense, that it was capable of making decisions that a human wouldn't make. So it's that, again, that view of it's like an abstract agency as well that's not embedded in what people are doing. So I don't know if there's no real equivalent in German. I don't know how to translate it, and I don't really know any German, but if anyone's got a suggestion of a good word we could use there.
Sorry,
in Swedish, we say.
I have a follow-up question on that. Like, how did they know that sort of decision, that a human would make that decision? How did they know? How do you know that?
Exactly. I mean, this would be my point. The narrative that built up around AlphaGo and the so-called divine move really removed the history of human playing of Go from the conversation. So the terminology comes from the game itself, but the suggestion that thousands of years of humans playing it wasn't relevant to this particular move, when actually that move was always within the scope of the boundaries of the game. It's just possible it wasn't a very popular move, and therefore, because it was unpopular and not used very often, it was surprising the moment that it was played. But it wasn't something that was distinctly super agential. It wasn't something that was beyond the capability of the game. It wasn't beyond the capability of the AI, and it wasn't even beyond the capability of the human. But we get all these stories around what happened. I heard a lot of people saying that Lisa Dole actually stood up and left at that point. Well, actually, if you watch the footage, he stood up at a different point and left for a cigarette break. So it becomes this story that we tell ourselves about what happened. So I'm seeing some other things come up. Okay, Succession. Yeah, I've watched. Sorry if people aren't looking at the chats. Andrew's saying that there is an interesting sidelight on agency in the series Succession, which I have watched series 1 and 2 of. But I should look that up. And
well, if people have watched it in Sweden, and I simply don't know. Okay, I mean, if it's not a thing there, this won't make sense. But basically, it's there's a scene in which a venture capitalist is turning down the anti-hero, the protagonist, who is a sort of monstrous Murdoch figure, who's trying to rescue himself from a scandal by getting brought out temporarily by a couple of venture capitalists. And he offers them a deal, and one of them says, "No, sorry, we've done the figures, and we're going to win this because our shareholders can do it, because your shareholders can do the sums, and they'll see that if they do what we want, they're going to make slightly more money than if they do what you want, and that's all it comes down to."
Right.
And in this instance, nobody feels they have any agency because they are absolutely bound simply to maximize shareholder value, or whatever they call it. I'm interested in the fringes in which humans feel they have no agency because
Yeah.
of something which would not be described as AI.
Yeah, I think we could go back to the blessed by the algorithm tweets, and the actual algorithm behind the scenes making recommendations on those sorts of platforms have a very specific value system that in some is replicable to, shareholder value quite often, attention economy, get eyes on these sorts of videos because these sorts of videos encourage engagement. And of course, those sorts of videos tend to be the most fringe, conspiracy laden, radical videos on YouTube. So there's certainly an element of that. But the perception that we're talking about with humans seeing the super agency of the algorithm being a picking and choosing, basically, that it's not driven by shareholder value, but just liking a particular human. So that suggests a level of, again, this messy word, consciousness, a conscious choice to pick you out of any number of humans rather than relating to the shareholder value and those sorts of very simplistic algorithmic decisions.
We have another question from
Okay.
Marcus Gottschling. Would you like to ask it, Marcus?
Yeah, I can ask it too. How would you say that utopian versus dystopian visions of AI are distributed within imaginaries or public imagination? So do you guess there are more utopian, the AI creation would be something more utopian, right?
Yeah.
Than dystopian. What would you say? Because I have the feeling that in Germany, the dystopian vision is far more present than the utopian vision, and my guess would be that in the US, for example, the utopian visions would be far more present than the dystopian. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so the danger here, unfortunately, is that you can end up making rather sweeping generalizations about nations, but I mean, quite commonly it's between a dichotomy of East versus West. And I think your example of Germany being perhaps more dystopic can push back against that, because the assumption sometimes is the one realm of the East is more utopian and the West is more dystopian. But your example there of Germany versus the US, that actually you feel like the US is probably more utopian. It's a very muddled ground that you can't necessarily bound simply by geographic states, and that actually you want to get really sort of elbow deep into the history of a country and a culture to understand what the relationship with technology more broadly construed is as well, not just with AI, but also, the East-West dichotomy generally comes about because of a very shallow dive into a history of animism in the East and the assumption that there isn't an equivalent animistic history in the West. So once you actually sort of pay attention to some of the research that's been done, some anthropological, some historical, about cultures and communities that have wider potential cosmologies of beings, that they can draw in more distinct entities into their understanding of what a being can be. And that goes beyond, as I say, this dichotomy of East versus West, where people tend to indicate towards Shintoism in Japan, for example, and ignore animistic traditions in Western cultures. So I think it's a fair point to say there's a difference perhaps between Germany and the US, but you can get more granular than that as well and say the US itself is not monolithic, Germany is not monolithic. Is the interpretation of AI distinctly different in southern states in the US versus the imagined cosmopolitan East and West coasts? Can we also, as I like to do, look at the religious interpretations that can be geographically grounded, but also transglobal? So what's the influence of, say, a evangelical interpretation on AI? We've had some material from sort of Baptist communities on their own rules and regulations they'd like to see for AI. So there's all these different cultures and communities in play with each other. So it becomes very difficult to say the German interpretation or the US interpretation, although some people try to sort of bound by nation states.
Thanks a lot. Great, thank you. Just one quick follow-up. Do you have any reading suggestions to what the shallow and the deep dive you just mentioned? So anything about the animism thing and Western animism?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really great scholars on Western animism. I'm trying to get something together on this specifically. So I look at people like Graham Harvey in the UK. He's very good on animistic traditions. See, this is where my memory for names is so bad, but I'm putting something together at the moment, so perhaps there will be a fuller reading list. But Josephson Storm. Josephson Storm, I will have to look these names up, but there's a very good history of the concept of the Enlightenment that draws out some of the animistic traditions that continued past our sort of meta-narrative of the increasing rationality of European states. So the ideas of the Enlightenment being the end of religion and the end of more spiritually focused religions. But yeah, maybe I'll pull together a reading list. Okay, no problem.
We have another question from Alexa in the chat. Alexa, if you want, you can speak up. Otherwise, we can read.
Okay, I can speak up. German accent warning. I wanted to ask do you think that human-machine interaction strategies like anthropomorphization, for example, when you have voice assistants having a human name like Alexa and a whole backstory and a whole persona, do you think that this enforces this kind of personification of AI that you talked about? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of really good work specifically on how we create stories around AI assistants, that we not only give them standard responses that the machine learning algorithm would pick up from what we've asked them, but we also give them more humorous responses. There are script writers for AI assistants to give them personality. There's lots of really great work on the dangers of gendered AI assistants and what kind of implications we have, and more broadly in gendered robots as well. It's a concern because for some, you could interpret this as a corporate hacking of people's tendency towards anthropomorphism anyway, that it leads people into particular ways of viewing AI that aren't realistic to how the technology is capable of being used. So I have to say Sophia is unfortunately one of my particular bugbears. She's not specifically an AI assistant, but basically her technology is no more advanced than an AI assistant. And the representation of Sophia as a being with desires and emotions and plans for her future, that she wants children, when the corporation behind Sophia also wants to sell a child version of Sophia. So there is a connection there between the anthropomorphism and the more commercial hype aspect as well. I think that's a dangerous path to go down. I think we need more education on critical thinking about our engagement with AI assistants and how we can sort of question the representations that we're being granted when we purchase an Alexa and put it in our house. I think that's a whole area of research that's really quite fascinating. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? I have one more question of my own. Let Tina go first.
Thank you. So this might be a stupid question, but I've been thinking about something. I'm not in this field at all. So could you say that since you talked about how AI beat human beings in this game, I don't remember the name.
StarCraft 2, yeah.
Could you say that it has sort of reached singularity in that realm? Is this something that you could actually say? I mean, there will be different things that AI will be much better than human beings at. Could you say that this is a singularity in a way?
Yeah, the difficulty with the technological singularity is that there is no singular singularity. So there are lots of different interpretations of what that term means. For some people, it is, as you say, being basically super intelligent, as Nick Bostrom used the term, that those two terms, though, aren't always synonymous. So for some people, it's also about consciousness. For some, it's an exponential growth of intelligence that goes beyond anything that we can actually conceive of. For some, it's about drawing in other technologies. So the singularity could not only be smarter than us, but it could create matter and change matter with nanotechnology. There's a whole variety of interpretations. It's a very difficult kind of thing to pin down to one space. But I think I've seen certainly people make the argument that in terms of narrow intelligence like AlphaGo, that it can only play Go. It can be the technology that was used to create it and the techniques can be redone for another format, but you couldn't take AlphaGo and set it off playing a completely different game, or you couldn't then ask it to interact with you like you would an AI assistant. So it has that narrow domain. But certainly I've seen some people argue that that is an example of superintelligence in that narrow domain because it can beat a human successfully several times over, and can score so highly, even playing against itself, which is another technique that they used for enhancing it. So yes, some people make the argument for a narrow domain superintelligence, but in general discourse, when people are talking about superintelligence, they're drawing on the Nick Bostrom interpretation of something that is so powerful, its very existence causes an existential threat because it can, make decisions, or it can act in a way that's detrimental to human flourishing, even if it isn't all the way to consciousness. This is like for some people, it's a stepping off point before the technological singularity, but you could ask it to do something, but its immense power could lead to unforeseen consequences. I think Bostrom's parable of the sparrows, I think that's what it's called, is a neat way of talking about this, that it's inciting something to come. The superintelligence in the parable, it's an owl egg that the sparrows really want to have, but they don't take the time to learn how to use it or to control it. So it's an unforeseen, powerful entity, more powerful than humans. And by that definition, you could say in the field of Go, that's the case. But because it's narrow, it's not going to have as much impact as the singularity. So those are some of the interpretations anyway.
One more from Andrew.
Ooh. Yeah, I've seen variations of that as well. I've even seen the argument, actually, Andrew, you might have been at this conference, I'm not sure. Someone arguing the singularity already happened after the Second World War, like the exponential growth of technology. Were you at that one? Or was it? Were you there?
Charlie Stross has made the argument. But
yeah, Stross. I've been talking to Stross recently about singularity on a couple of things, and yeah, he's made that statement. He's got some plans for some more singularity busting fiction coming soon, I think. Yeah, that's interesting because, again, as I say, if there's no singular definition of singularity, and you just talk about it as some sort of exponential growth or development.
Well, I mean, I'm being slightly unfair to the Robinson argument, which was really that science becomes an AI in exactly the sort of hybrid sense that I was talking about, as it's presently conducted. So much of it done on computers,
Yeah.
And the humans are the sense apparatus, and they're feeding it stuff, and it's feeding stuff back out.
You might also think about David Runciman talks about corporations as artificial agents, and corporations as the singularity, or the stock exchange, or there's various variations on this, but we've got it already argument, which is very interesting because, as I say, it's the fluidity of the definition. If you say it's something that massively grows, takes in things, and grows even more, you're running out of things that aren't the singularity. So everything. The universe is the singularity. I mean, it's exponentially growing as well, I think. I'm not a cosmologist, but yes. So yeah, if everything is special, then nothing is, as the Incredibles said. So it makes an interesting area to look at anthropologically, because the variety of interpretations and when they butt up against each other, and the different groups who dedicate themselves to that idea, and the tensions and the contrast between them.
We're almost running out of time, but can I ask my question? So much of your talk points to high or low signal to noise ratio in the discussion about future AI technologies. There's a lot of crazy stuff that goes viral, and that creates a difficult situation for those researchers who have serious things to say about possible future catastrophic risks from AI technologies. And you mentioned Bostrom already. At your own university, there are people at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. And I count myself to this research field as well. Do you have any advice for us how we can moderate the discussion or make sane voices heard?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, like I say, there are some groups that are doing some really interesting work, not only around AI narratives, images of AI, looking at public discourse. I mean, I keep pushing for education at a younger age, which is something I don't see in a lot of, well, maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't seen in a lot of AI ethics conversations about how we engage with younger people, not in a kind of fuddy-duddy young people way, but like actual children, because I've done some, not very many, but some schools outreach talks where already they have a very large, at a very young age of like 7, 8, 9 years old, a large vocabulary of what an AI is. Of course, they frame it in terms of machines and robots, but they've seen a lot of science fiction, and they sort of, in some cases, they expect this to be around the corner. And I think if we had a little more early years, and I'm talking mostly about the UK situation because I don't know other countries and their education system so well, and I have a son in the UK system, so I know a little bit more about that. But if we had more from the very beginning, a kind of basic toolkit of what is an algorithm and how will it influence your life? What is this thing we call AI and how is it represented in science fiction? Does it matter that we represent it in particular ways, and what is the impact of that? Then that would help the general kind of AI literacy. So when the A-level students in that particular instance were pushing back against the algorithm, they should be pushing back more against the politicians and not focusing on this thing that is human created. It's not a mutant algorithm. It didn't go out of control. It did exactly what it was told to do. And again, that's personified language, but I recognize the limitations as well. But so I would say if some of these research institutes were a little more focused on public engagement and a little more focused on younger public engagement as well. It's not something I'm aware of many of those places doing. But I'm happy to be corrected if I've missed things. But I recognize some of the problems with that as well, because I did do my series of short films. One of them came out the same day or the same week as Stuart Russell's Slaughterbots. So I recognize like the if you go strongly into the dystopian, you get so many more views than any kind of reasoned response that we tried to do in our short films. So there's that danger as well, that if you start getting into public engagement, you've got the balance doesn't always get you the hits. That's why the press images of the Terminator are so prolific. There's so many of them because that's what gets attention.
Okay, thank you. It seems Tina Wheeler in the chat expresses agreement with the need for education in these domains.
Yeah, there's some excellent work on digital literacy in schools and how to be online and and privacy. Even at my son's age, like they talk about, who do you talk to online, but there needs to be something around what is the technology that's being put into systems and how is it distinctly different to your imagination of robots and what's similar and what's different. So yeah, so there we go.
We are out of time. Thank you so much, Beth, for a wonderful talk and discussion, and thank you everyone for participating in this very lively and stimulating discussion. One more round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation as well. I had a very good time.
Thank you.
Hello.